So I should just tell you, if you haven't noticed, that we are recording this and there is a chance it may end up in the public domain on YouTube or something. So if you're not supposed to be here, just don't ask any questions. I have somebody who comes, he used to come regularly to my talks in London, and his partner was absolutely not allowed to know where he was going because his partner strongly disapproved of him going to talks about non-duality. That might be a good place to start this afternoon. Let's see, I don't know where that might lead. Why might somebody's partner object from going to talks on non-duality? That might emerge as the afternoon unfolds, I don't know. There's something very wonderful about this communication, and there's also something very threatening about it. Well, there's something about it that some people find very threatening. This chap's partner did. In a way, it's fairly easy to talk about non-duality, but it's completely impossible to understand it. So it can be quite frustrating. We'll see. We'll see. Talks on non-duality can be quite frustrating because kind of the words make sense, the ideas make sense, and yet somehow there is something about it where the word ineffable really is appropriate. You know, something's ineffable, it just can't be put into words. And yet, I could sit here and I can start off by thinking, well, I could sum up non-duality, very simply in very few words. I'll start by saying, what's the seeing of non-duality? What's that mean? What's it about? The seeing of non-duality is very simple. It's the seeing that there is no self. That's a very brief and very adequate summary of what seeing non-duality is. What's seeing non-duality? It's seeing that there is no self. It couldn't be simpler, and yet it couldn't be more impossible to understand from the position of the one who feels that they are a self or feels that they have a self. Non-duality is seeing that because there is no self, there's no separation. And it's a very simple sentence to say, but it's impossible to see, it's impossible to understand for the one whose experience of life has always been from the position of separation, the one who has always felt themselves to be separate. It's like, well, what does that mean? I'm sitting here and I'm about to say that the normal experience of most people is the experience of separation, is the experience that they are separate. What does that mean, separate from what? Well, the normal experience of most people is, if you like, is that there are essentially two things or two aspects to experience, two aspects of the world, two aspects to existence, if you like. Non-duality is opposed to duality, and duality is two-ness, two things. So what are these two things that makes most people feel separate? Well, one of them is the person themselves. That's one thing. I may feel myself to be kind of like a thing, like an object, a separate entity. That's one thing. And the other thing, the second thing, is that this separate entity moves around inside something else, and the something else is the world. And that's where the sense of separation comes from. That's what duality or two-ness means. There is the sense of me as a separate person, and I move around inside this other thing called the world. I move through space, and I move through time, and I'm separate from the world, and I'm separate from everything that's in the world. So my life is a kind of constant process of negotiation with something other there's me and there's the other. We could describe the duality of everyday experience like that. We could say, well, one thing is me, and then the second thing is the other, everything else, which is the other. So my life is a kind of continual process of negotiation with the other, or negotiation with the world. And sometimes that negotiation goes pretty smoothly, and it's not terribly problematic, and life may flow quite well. But as we all know, sometimes that negotiation with the other can become extremely difficult, extremely problematic. So I go through life moving in this stuff called space and time, meeting these other people and objects and negotiating with them. And that's where my sense of separation comes from. And of all the different things that I may need to negotiate with in the world, the most problematic of all, of course, are these strange beings known as other people. They are by far the most difficult thing to negotiate with. And that, in a way, that's a description of separation. Separation means I feel separate from everything else. And what we're talking about here is the possibility of that sense collapsing. That's all we're talking about. We're just talking about the possibility that that sense, which I am a separate person who has to negotiate with other separate people, may simply collapse. I mean, there's kind of two basic statements that I sometimes feel I could start with if I'm giving a talk about non-duality. One is that one. One is that non-duality is the collapse of the sense of separation. It's seeing that there is actually no separation. And then the other statement that I might make is that non-duality is freedom. Non-duality is the seeing of freedom. In fact, it might sound like a very absolute statement to make, and it might sound like a statement that might invite challenge, and if you want to challenge it, you're most welcome to challenge it, and we can talk about it. But the other statement is that non-duality is freedom. I'm going to go further than that, and I'm going to say non-duality, seeing non-duality, is not just freedom, it's the only real freedom that there is. We could define freedom in many, many different ways, and I'm going to sit here in this chair, and until you challenge me about this, I am going to assert that seeing through separation, seeing non-duality, seeing that there is no separate self, is the only real freedom. And as philosophers sometimes point out, really, we could say essentially that word freedom, it's a bit slippery, but essentially we could say, well, actually there are two different kinds of freedom. There are what's usually called freedom to do stuff. I'm free to do this, I'm free to do this, I'm free to do that, I'm free to do what I want, or not what to do what I want. That's not the freedom that I'm talking about here. The freedom I'm talking about here is the other kind of freedom that we're kind of taught about in Philosophy 101, as it were, as a first year at university, which is freedom from. It's quite different to freedom to. What I'm talking about here is freedom from the tyranny of the self. I'm going to sit here and assert, and as the afternoon goes on, you may challenge me about this or you may not, and I might expand on this or I might not. But what I'm going to assert here at the beginning of this afternoon is that seeing through the self, which means basically seeing that there is no self, is freedom from the tyranny of the self, that self is a kind of tyrant. The self lives with all kinds of assumptions about reality, which are actually false, but which seem very real. And these assumptions can be absolutely tyrannical. One of these assumptions, for example, I'm thinking, what on earth, you might be thinking, what on earth does that mean? And I'll try and unpick it a bit. One of the assumptions that the self lives with, for example, is the assumption of free will, choice and responsibility. Most cells live with these assumptions. In fact, a lot of cells or a lot of people will become very angry if you challenge these assumptions. You know, one of the quickest ways to make somebody angry out there on the streets of Berlin is to suggest to them that they don't actually have free will, that they don't actually make choices, that they don't actually have a self who could possibly make choices. That can be heard as highly offensive, because it can be heard as a kind of assault on everything that perhaps the average person believes, and all the values that they hold, and all the stories that they hold about life. And yet that's what's being asserted. You know, when non-duality is being talked about, if it's being talked about honestly, if it's being talked about clearly, then one of the most obvious things that is being asserted is there is no free will, there is no choice. If you like, not because free will and choice don't exist, although they don't, but because the one who has free will and choice does not exist. When the sense of the person collapses, when the sense of self collapses, it takes any possibility of free will and choice with it. When it's seen that there is no entity, there is no person, there is no entity that can exercise free will and choice. Now, for the average person, even if they don't realise this consciously, it doesn't take more than half a second to sort of realise that if free will and choice collapse, then all the stories upon which we build our meaning of life from also collapse, because all the stories about meaning in life depend on firstly they depend on there being something called me, which there isn't, who has something called free will, which I do not have, through which I can exercise something called choice, which I cannot do. I think that's about as clearly as I can put it. You know, but any story about life having any kind of meaning or purpose, or the idea that life is somehow going somewhere, just completely collapses. So if you suggest to somebody out there in a bar in Berlin, and I seriously suggest that you do not try this tonight, but if you go up to a random stranger in a bar in Berlin tonight and engage them in conversation and then suggest that they don't exist as a person and therefore they have no free will and no choice and that they've never made a decision in their life, then don't be surprised if you get quite an aggressive response from them, because it's a very challenging thing to say to somebody who fully believes in everything that I am denying. I mean, basically, I'm sitting here in this chair. I mean, how dare I? What am I up to? I'm sitting here in this chair and I am denying all the obvious truths. I hope the camera's picking up the air quotation marks there. I'm sitting here and denying the obvious truths by which almost all of us live, and through which almost all of us find a kind of a purpose in life. Most of us find some kind of purpose or meaning to life, which depends absolutely on the idea that there is an autonomous person here who can exercise these magic powers. I mean, it's a kind of magic power, really, you know, to exercise free will, to make a free choice. No philosopher in the history, the apparent history of the human species, has ever been able to explain how free will could possibly work, or how free will can possibly be exercised and by whom. And some philosophers have the honesty to admit this, but most philosophers don't. So most philosophers tie themselves up into knots trying to justify this amazing magical thing called free will and choice. And all I'm doing is sitting here and saying, well, you don't have to justify it, it isn't magical, it simply doesn't exist. But I'm not saying, I need to put this in now, because sometimes about an hour and a half later in the afternoon I get a question about this and I think, no, I didn't say that clearly enough. So I'm not saying Because sometimes when people hear there is no such thing as free will or choice, they say, oh, you're saying I'm powerless. I'm powerless to act. I will prove that I'm not powerless to act. With my own free will, I will pick up this glass of water and take a sip from it. There, I have just destroyed your entire afternoon's talk. But I'm not going to go into, I mean, that's nonsense, and that can very easily be torn apart, but I'm not going to go into that now. Right? What I'm going to go into, which is more to the point, is no, absolutely not. I am not saying you are powerless. I'm not saying there's a person there who is powerless to act. I mean, many philosophers would say that, and many philosophers do say that. They say, well, there is a person, but there's no free will and no free choice. So there's a person who's a kind of slave, as it were, a slave to their unconscious, or whatever. That's not what I'm saying. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. I'm not saying there is a person, but there's no free will, so there is an impotent person. I'm saying there is no one. There simply is no one. There's no person, therefore the whole idea of free will or choice simply collapses. So what is there then? Well, there's just whatever's happening. Let's just take the person out of this. Or something else perhaps I can also mention at this point, which may be equally challenging if you decide to have a conversation about this to a random stranger in a Berlin bar. We can take time out of this as well. You see, the person absolutely lives in time. I mean, the person has a history, the person has a memory of the past, and the person has expectations of the future. I don't know if this metaphor works or not, but it's a metaphor I sometimes use. I sometimes say the kind of like a fish swims in water, so a person swims through time. So a person, in a way, a person carries quite a heavy burden with them because they can carry the burden of the past, all their thoughts and memories and regrets about the past. And the future can be a burden because the person can also carry all their fears and anxieties and hopes about the future as well. And all of that also collapses when the sense of self collapses. You know, when it's seen that there's no one here, time also collapses. Just as the person is a kind of illusion. I use that word with caution, and if you want to, we can come back to it later and unpack it, but I'll just say that for now. When it's seen that the person is a kind of illusion, it's also seen that time is a kind of illusion. The sense of time being real, the sense that there is someone here who's moving from a personal history in the past to some personal adventure in the future, that also collapses. And at this point I've spent however long it is, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, I don't know, talking about what there isn't. You know, so there's no person, there's no past, there's no future, there's no purpose. We're not moving meaningfully towards some desired goal which does not exist now, but exists at some time in a non-existent future. There's none of that either. So what is there in that case? I mean, it's just simply a completely nihilistic communication about nothing. What is there if none of that is real? What is real in that case? Well, what's real is just this, is just whatever's happening. The temptation, because our minds are in a way constructed partly by language, and language is very conventional. The temptation is to say that what there is there's just this moment. I mean, that would be the kind of natural way of speaking. And there's nothing wrong with saying that, except it's slightly misleading, because a moment is something which exists in time. A moment is something which has duration and is preceded by a previous moment and followed by another moment. There's nothing particularly wrong with that description, but it's not really accurate. It is accurate. I mean, language can obviously never get this, but it gets a little bit closer to say, well, there's just this. What does that mean? Well, whatever's apparently happening, whatever's apparently going on in this. You know, that's what's real, somebody moving. there. I saw that, you didn't. So for me, that was real. Somebody moving, an expression on the face. Whatever's noticed, whatever phenomena's arising, a movement there. Perhaps, I don't know, a bicycle going past. The colour of a chair, the faint rumbling sound of a door being closed and in a cough. That's what's real, that's what life consists of. No past, no future, just whatever's happening. And by the way, I don't know, but some people find the idea that there is no, the statement that there is no past and no future very challenging. And in a way it is, to say, oh, there's no time, there's no past, there's no future. That could be heard as extremely challenging. But in another sense, what I usually assert is it's also completely obvious, isn't it? Isn't it completely obvious that all there is this? That simple statement, all there is this, could be heard as pointing towards something, I don't know, incredible philosophical complexity, I don't know. But in another sense, isn't it also completely obvious that all there is this? That nothing else exists other than, to put it tautologically in a very obvious way, you might think, well, why is he even bothering to say that? All that exists is what exists. There is just this. Anything, I'm hesitating because I'm looking for a formula of words that will fit here, and language is really inadequate for describing this, because language describes the normal experience of the separated person who feels that they do live in time, and does have a past and does have a future. But all there is this, could be heard as an absolutely and totally obvious statement. Well, let me put it this way. No one sitting in this room, I am going to claim, no one sitting in this room has ever experienced 1 second of the future or 1 second of the past. The past and future can only exist as thoughts and feelings in this. There can be thoughts and there can be feelings which seem to attach to something called the past or the future. Very often they're feelings, because as I've already mentioned, quite strong feelings can attach to thoughts of the past or the future, like thoughts of regret, feelings of regret, like feelings of anxiety, that kind of thing. And yet, no one in this room can experience any thought or any feeling about the past or the future except in this. If we want to clarify and say that means except in the present, we can say that, but that's a little bit confusing, because the present is usually held only to make sense, against the ideas of the past and the future. So let's just stick with this, just this. Anything that's experienced can only be experienced in this. Any thought or memory or regret or feeling about the past is only ever experienced in this, and the same goes for the future. And it is just this, is the most, in some sense it's very challenging, and in another sense it is the most obvious thing that anybody can possibly say. So there's no person, there's no past, there's no future. Notice, I don't know if there's a slight diversion, but I'll throw it in. Notice that for those of us who have been through, and some of us in this room, including myself, might have been through multifarious spiritual paths, and again I hope the camera's picking up the air quotation marks there. Many of us may have been through numerous spiritual paths and practiced all sorts of techniques. I myself practiced several techniques. And a lot of these techniques, in a way, are about trying to give a kind of feel to what I'm talking about. Now, if you think about mindfulness, for example, which has become an extremely popular technique over the last 10 years, you sort of Buddhist mindfulness, and then this kind of mindfulness practiced out there, stripped of its kind of Buddhist accretions. If you think about that, it's kind of designed to give the person sort of a touch or a flavour of what I'm talking about here, what it is simply to live in this, because mindfulness attempts, in a way, to consciously direct our attention away from thoughts and feelings which seem to be about the past, and away from thoughts and feelings which seem to be about the future. And so notice, well, a few minutes ago I was saying it's just this, look, an arm moved, colour of a chair, the sound of a wicker chair creaking, the pressure of a seat on a vase. That's what mindfulness in a way is about. So what I'm saying is that this apprehension, this realisation can simply arise naturally. The techniques that we might or might not have practiced, but if we have, the techniques that we practice, the spiritual paths that we've travelled, these kind of things, they're kind of ersatz or artificial way of trying to give rise to what is actually talked about directly with the communication of non-duality. And what I'm saying is that when the self collapses, there's no need for any practice. There's no need for any artificial attempt to direct my attention to the colour of that chair rather than my fears about something that might happen in an imaginary future next week. Because when the self collapses, that just happens naturally. When the self collapses, there is simply, this is a bit of an inaccurate phrase, but I use it because language is so poor at describing this. There's simply more presence naturally arising. You could say that a practice like mindfulness, for example, seeks to increase the person's awareness of presence, of what's actually happening right now, to use a time-bound phrase. And what I'm saying is when the sense of self collapses, there's no need for practices. There is simply the natural arising of presence, or a greater awareness of presence. I've talked to lots of people about this. I put myself into a position, I put myself, like quite a lot of other people who are speaking about this, into a kind of a public position in the sense that, I've got a website and I write books and, I'm on Facebook and people are able to phone me up or email me if they've got questions about this. So as a result of that, over the years, I've talked to quite a lot of people where this seeing has arisen, and very often people are able to say very little about it. It's so difficult to put this into words. I mean, it's amazing that there are, as it were, I don't know what to call us, a gang of non-duality communicators. I don't know what the group now is for non-duality communicators. People that sit in rooms like this in chairs and talk about this all over, I don't know, all over the world, but all over Europe. A gang, a bevy, an army of non-duality communicators, I don't know. But it's not easy to talk about, and a lot of people have talked to me directly and in writing and have tried to express kind of what's happened to them, or paradoxically we could say, or what actually hasn't happened to them, and tried to put it into words and found it very, very, very difficult. And in the end, all they can perhaps say is just reduced to, well, I can't explain what's happened. All I know is somehow, there's more presence, or there's more of this, or there's less of the past, or there's less of the future, or there's less of the feelings that go with that. I mean, one person I remember years ago was talking to me, trying to explain what had happened. We have to use words, and the words awakening and liberation are not good words. But years ago I remember talking to somebody and she was trying to explain this awakening, again, quotation marks in the air for that word awakening. And she said, I can't tell you what's happened, Richard, all I can say is I'm not depressed anymore.
I'm
not depressed anymore. And there may be many reasons for that. But in a way, the sheer collapse of the reality of the past and future might be enough to explain that. Because with the collapse of the past and future, maybe there's nothing to be depressed about anymore. I don't know, I talk to lots and lots of people who, for want of better words, and I mean these words are really bad words to use, but what the hell, I talk to many, many people who've had awakenings, who've seen, I'll throw this phrase in for now and just let it lie there and maybe come back to it later if we need to. I talk to many, many people who've seen the emptiness of everything, because that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about seeing that this is empty of self. And when this is seen to be empty of self, that, the external world, is also seen to be empty. Because they're the same thing. If this is empty, then that is empty. And if that is empty, then this is empty. Because they're the same thing. And I talk to many people who've seen the fullness of everything, because that's part of the paradox of this. We can talk about this as being empty, and we can also talk about this as being full. And because I can't say everything at once, I'll park that idea up and we can come back to it if we need to. But for the moment, I'm just going to say that this is seen to be both empty and full. And I talk to many people who've seen either simply the emptiness of everything, which is sometimes called awakening. I talk to many people who've seen the emptiness of everything and the fullness of everything, which is sometimes called liberation. And sometimes they're able to say almost nothing about it because it is so difficult to communicate. So they may be reduced to, I can't tell you what's happened, all I can say is I'm not depressed anymore. What a simple and in a way, what a beautiful statement. So that's what we're here to talk about this afternoon. There's nothing and there's everything. And they are the same thing. This is all there is. What's happening is all there is. There is nothing other than this. Any thought about something other than this is simply a thought arising in this. There's nothing and there's everything. There's emptiness and there's fullness. There's silence and there's noise. There's stillness and there's movement. And they are the same thing. And when that's seen, it's like, one of the reports that is quite often made is that when this is seen, there's laughter. Or at least a quiet smile. And we might feel entitled to ask, well, what's that laughter about? What's that quiet smile about? Well, it can seem pretty funny if this is suddenly seen to realise that all my life's searching, all my life's agony was just a thought. It's just for nothing. Because all the while there is just everything and nothing, and they're the same. And if I live in a noisy and busy place, and I have spent perhaps 5 years of my life going to retreats halfway up a mountain to find stillness and silence, and suddenly the self collapses, I might well burst out laughing when I realise that all that noise and all that busyness and all that activity was stillness and silence. It wasn't any different. I didn't need to go and sit in an ashram halfway up the Himalayas to experience stillness and silence, because noise is silence making a noise, and movement is stillness moving. An activity is nothing manifesting as activity. There is no difference. So if I've spent, let's make it 10 years, let's get a little bit more dramatic about this. If I spent 10 years meditating in a monastery to find stillness and silence, and then I'm standing in the middle of Berlin's busiest road junction. I don't know where that is. If this was London, I could tell you, but I'm standing in the middle of Berlin's busiest road junction, and the self suddenly drops away, which is quite possible to happen. And I might well burst out laughing when I realise that Berlin's busiest road junction is as still and as silent as a monastery halfway up a mountain. There is no difference. And I can't remember if I've already said this. I think I said it near the beginning, but if I did, I'm repeating it. If I didn't, I'm throwing it in now. With the seeing of this, all stories collapse. All stories of meaning collapse, and that's one of them. That's a story of meaning and purpose. I need to go to this monastery, this sacred place, halfway up the mountain. Long ago, when I was a very devoted and sincere spiritual teacher, and believe me, I was, for quite a long time, I remember somebody telling me very reverentially, I mean, I might have got the details of this wrong, this is just an anecdote, and therefore it's as unreliable as any other anecdote, but I remember a Buddhist friend of mine telling me very reverentially about a temple in Japan where there had been uninterrupted chanting continuing for 800 years. Think of that, 8 centuries of chanting. I mean, if you're a spiritual seeker, that really means something. I mean, obviously not just one monk, monks had changed, but nevertheless, for 800 years there had never been a moment in this Japanese monastery where chanting, sacred chanting, had been going on. And this was said to me in a tone of great reverential awe, and I received it with a tone of great reverential awe. And probably, I can't remember at that time, something in me went, oh, I wish I could visit that monastery. You know, the feeling there must be so amazing. Such a holy place. So that's one of the stories. That's what I mean by story. It's just a story. It's just a kind of an invention of the mind. That's what a story is. So all of those stories collapse when the sense of self collapses. It's just ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. Nowhere is any more and nowhere is any less holy than anywhere else. Because there's just this. There's just silence. And sound, and stillness, and movement. There's just emptiness and fullness. It doesn't make any difference if we're halfway up a mountain in Japan, in a monastery where chanting has been happening for 800 years, or whether we are standing in the middle of the busiest road junction in Berlin. They are equally full and equally empty. They are equally still and equally moving. Equally silent and equally sounding. And that's why sometimes there's laughter when this is seen, because all of the stories by which the person lives through just collapse. It just seems to be absurd. It all collapses. And that's again why, if you pick a conversation in Berlin tonight with somebody and start talking to them about this, they may get very upset, particularly if they're, what do you have here? We have vicars. What do you have? Do you have ministers here? Priests, ministers, perhaps particularly... Pastors. Pastors, well, particularly if they're a pastor or a priest, they might get very upset. Some people's, I mean, all our lives as people, all our lives as separate individuals are predicated, are built on meaning of some kind. Even an existentialist life is built on meaning. And of course, if we're a priest or a pastor, it's likely to be particularly built on meaning. All of it collapses. Every belief we have about life collapses. Think about it. Every belief we have about life collapses. This can be a terrible shock. Terrible shock, particularly if the beliefs that we have are particularly holy, particularly meaningful. If we want to hold on to our beliefs about life, if we want to hold on to our stories, if we want to hold on to our rather precious feeling that life is going somewhere, it has a goal and a purpose, and I can contribute to that, which is a very popular story at the moment, well, in a way it always has been. If we want to hang on to that, we should run away from talks and books about non-duality as fast as we can. I have a friend who's an enthusiast for non-duality, and she also, it's not just intellectual with her, she sees this. She doesn't give talks about it, but she probably could if she wanted to. She sees this. And she took a friend to a meeting once, not one of my meetings, somebody else, and this friend was a passionate spiritual seeker. And after the meeting, she was talking to this friend, and he said, "But you don't understand." He said, "I like my searching. I like it." And he never went back to another meeting. And in a sense, all we can say is, yeah, absolutely. If you like seeking, if seeking's your hobby, if it's your interest in life, it's your seeking, don't go near non-duality. Put the book back on the shelf. Leave the book in the bookshop. Don't go on to non-duality channels on YouTube. Don't come to meetings like this. Because if you come to non-duality, and if non-duality seizes you, which it doesn't always with everyone, but if you come to non-duality, you're taking that risk that non-duality might seize you, and then you're lost. That's it. It's over for you. You won't be able to take all that stuff seriously anymore. I'll finish in a minute. I think this is quite long enough for an introduction talk. That just makes me think, it's just a quotation I particularly like, which I often, if non-duality seizes you, Ramana Maharshi, that wonderful phrase he used, which I can remember inaccurately now, so this will have to go down on record as an inaccurate statement of the great holy Ramana Maharshi's words. The tiger has seized you by the neck. Non-duality, if it seizes you, it's like a tiger seizing you by the neck. I love that image because it expresses, obviously metaphorically, very much metaphorically, and yet somehow very clearly, what happens to some of us when we come near non-duality. It just seizes us by the neck. And it's beyond reason, it's beyond even emotion, it can't be explained, it's just something